review of Obduction will contain major plot details and puzzle solutions for this game, as well as Myst and Riven. If you haven't played them, then I recommend watching my video on Riven so you can decide whether these games interest you before continuing. After a successful crowdfunding campaign, the company that brought us Myst has returned with Obduction, a game which abandons the mythology of the Myst series but carries on its spirit of Myst. It's not just the gameplay that's reminiscent of those older titles, but the premise too. The opening sees the player whisked away to a strange world with absolutely no idea what's going on. Right from the get-go, this is one of Obduction's greatest strengths. The early moments really managed to recapture the wonder of stepping into Myst for the first time, something that got progressively weaker with each installment of the series as you became more familiar with the mythology behind linking books and so on. Listening to the holographic introduction by the mayor and seeing the juxtaposition of a white picket fence encapsulated by an alien landscape confirms what every fan of the Myst series was hoping for. Obduction is an absurd premise, but a totally grounded presentation. Pretty much everything is explained and has a reason to exist, even more so than in the Myst series where the linking book concept could be used to hand-wave away some of the stranger elements of each age. Things don't have to make perfect sense when characters have access to the very fabric of the world itself. Obduction has no such safety net, which makes it all the more convincing. Once you accept the idea that seeds are seemingly randomly abducting parts of Earth across time and space, the rest just falls into place. A large part of this comes down to the visual design, which is littered with minor world-building details. One of the best examples is the cemetery at the beginning. With limited space inside the dome, the existing graves that were initially in the Hartnell mining town have been repurposed for the people who died after it became Hunrath. This is something you might not realize at first, but as your understanding of the situation improves, you unlock more of the story just by paying attention to your surroundings. This scene in the Kaptar Dome shows part of 2 other planets, as well as the handiwork of the 2 previous sentient races that existed alongside the RI. It's quietly teeming with so much history that most other game worlds seem embarrassingly simple by comparison. Elsewhere in Kaptar, these random spheres carved out of the terrain serve no purpose, but show that the game adheres to its own internal logic at all times. This is such a high priority that it takes precedence even when it might conflict with the player's progression. The blue beam in Hunrath looks dangerous, which discouraged me from walking past it until I realized there was nowhere else to go. At first, it seemed stupid to me that the designers would place the beam directly in the player's path like that, but later it becomes clear why CW would want it pointing at the entrance to his compound. Even when resorting to documents for exposition, they're left in logical locations. The temptation would be to scatter these notebooks across the whole game as a reward for exploration and to avoid dumping too much info on the player at once. Instead, they're almost all inside Farley's house because that's where they'd actually be. It's this unwavering attention to detail that really sells the world, allowing you to believe that there's thought behind everything. It never became clear to me why Hunrath has a wall constructed down the middle, but because of all the aforementioned details, I get the impression that someone on the development team has a reasonable explanation for it. Whether they actually do or not isn't really the point. What's important is that I think they do. With the exception of the Marais Gauntlet, which seems far too convoluted for its purpose, Obduction succeeds at accomplishing its goal of transporting you to a bizarre place that you can actually believe in. As for the visuals themselves, they might look more painterly than outright realistic, but they still easily eclipse the complexity of the Myst series while being rendered in real time. Naturally, this comes at a performance cost, in this case an unfortunately large one. So large, in fact, that at release it was plagued with constant, cripplingly long hitches as well as excruciating load times that effectively made it unplayable. Now, my PC isn't the powerhouse it once was, but it runs plenty of demanding, recent games at high settings with no problem. The performance of Obduction really confused me until I read a blog post by the developers which said, "A generic traditional mechanical hard drive is going to see a lot of hitching and pausing during the game while it loads in." So I did what any reasonably obsessive reviewer would do and went one step further. Noticing that the install only takes up 14 gigabytes, I decided that instead of upgrading to a solid state drive, I'd buy 32 gigabytes of RAM, turn half of that into a RAM drive and install the game there instead. This gives access speeds exceeding even the best SSDs, which easily took the game from unplayable to smooth, but even so, it's maybe not the kind of jump you'd hope for. With patches, load times have improved dramatically since release, but even now, after going to such extreme lengths to find a solution, occasional stutters are still present. At this point, the CPU is probably the bottleneck, and we could go down this performance rabbit hole forever, but my point is that the visuals don't seem to justify these kinds of problems. It might be fair to say that it's worth playing the game just to gawk at its wonderful backdrops, but these are impressive more because of good art direction than technical wizardry. I don't want to excuse poor optimization, but I am reminded of playing Riven back when it came on 5 CDs. Hardware advancements have made that problem extinct, so I fully expect, even if Obduction never gets patched again, that the same will eventually be true here too. Using a RAM drive gets you most of the way there already, so it's not hard to envision a stutter-free future where swap devices just dissolve and reform the world in one smooth motion. As an analytical reviewer, this is where I'm torn and why I've dedicated so many words to this issue in the first place. Right now, these performance hiccups are Obduction's most glaring flaw, but give it some time and it'll be nothing more than a complaint in an old video by some forgotten reviewer. There's nothing more I can say about this, so you'll have to decide for yourself what to think about this annoying but temporary problem while I sit uncomfortably on the white picket fence. Fortunately, or unfortunately, there are some aspects of the design I can concretely criticize. Despite the environments feeling reasonably dense, at times there's some backtracking over relatively long distances, and since this is a straight-up puzzle adventure game we're talking about, there's nothing to do in between. Riven is occasionally guilty of this too, but it's basically a non-issue because you can click your way through the islands at light speed. These scenic walks in Obduction are made all the more aggravating by how poorly fenced off some areas are. This tiny drop in Marais requires you to swap to Hunrath and back to circumvent it, and by the time you're finished, you might be tempted to list this shallow river as Obduction's primary antagonist. There are even more holes that can be poked in the level design, like this gate that could be easily opened from the other side, or the Imager rocks, which block you from passing through them even though they presumably have no physical presence. Given the amount of effort that went into making the environment believable, these kinds of oversights stand out all the more. At least mechanically, these kinds of detours are an essential way of testing the player's spatial awareness, which seems to be the main focus of Obduction. The wraparound effect on the domes presents a similar sort of challenge, and together with the seeds, these make up the vast majority of puzzles. Doing so much uneventful walking can be boring, but it serves an important function by discouraging players from brute forcing a solution through trial and error. If you know you stand to waste a couple of minutes of your time, then you'll probably think twice about what you're doing first. For an example of what goes wrong when player laziness isn't punished, look no further than the villain numbering panels. Initially thrilled to see a throwback to my favourite puzzle from Riven, these became a big letdown for me once I realised how easy they were to brute force. Even though I understood the numbering system thanks to the cash register mechanism, on my first playthrough I never realised how that related to the appearance of the platforms in Marais. Thanks partially to their self-correcting nature, it's not necessary to understand these things in order to get past them, and worse still, once you figure it out, you can just use the same command over and over to create the rest of the bridges. This is especially disappointing because the puzzles in Riven seemed specifically designed so players couldn't use these sorts of tactics. Try blindly filling in the marble puzzle in Riven and you only have a 1 in 94 trillion chance of getting it correct, and that's assuming you already know what to do with the yellow one. There's no point making players enter the same number over and over again, so these panels should have been drastically redesigned to take advantage of the numbering system instead. Since we know the Mofang have trouble seeing the colour blue, I think a blue number should have been written somewhere nearby, which the player would then have to enter in villain notation, like a password. That way, the numbers could have been different for each bridge, starting out small and ending in a larger, more complicated figure as an ultimate test of the player's understanding. Right now, there's only one panel where you have to enter a specific number, which would be fine if it actually forced you to understand how the numbers work, but it doesn't. The cash register teaching method can be easily exploited to look up the solution. Even if Marais was completely littered with password-protected panels, this would still be a problem, but at least being forced to backtrack every time would punish players who relied on the cash register to do the work for them. Of course, it would be even better if that crutch was less reliable as well. The Wark game in Riven is clever on several levels, but arguably the best thing about it is that it gives out a random number each time. By being unpredictable, it encourages you to watch and think about what's happening. Even in a worst case scenario where a player decides to just write down each number, they'd have to spin the wheel so much that by the time they all came up, there's a good chance they'd intuitively understand them all anyway. If the villain numbers had been taught the same way, it would have been even better. With 1024 possible combinations, you wouldn't have been able to rely on luck to give you the exact number that you wanted. Instead, you'd have to look at a few random ones and infer how the system works based on those. If that seems too harsh, then the random selection could have been skewed towards certain numbers which would make the inner workings more obvious to the player. It's possible that Cyan wanted to avoid rehashing the Riven setup entirely, which would be an admirable position for them to take. In that case, even just tweaking the existing mechanism so that players couldn't enter human numbers would have gone a long way towards improving it. As it is now, plugging numbers directly into the register allows you to skip that mental step, which is where the puzzle really happens. This is a niche genre which appeals to players who liked the challenging nature of the Myst series, so rather than try to cater to everyone, I think they should have focused on the people who really wanted it, especially since it was crowdfunded by that very crowd. Those issues with the puzzles are a letdown, but ultimately they don't overshadow the game's merits. Individually, none of the obstacles in Obduction rival the best that Myst and Riven had to offer, but it's commendable how it's not over-reliant on a single type of problem. There's the quirk with the domes, seed swapping, a numbering system, documents with passwords, and basic puzzle mechanisms to figure out. Even though the numbering system was somewhat botched, I still wrung a lot of enjoyment out of it regardless because I spent the time to understand it as early as possible. I never got a chance to demonstrate that knowledge, but I still acquired it, which is the hard part. I think that sums up the flaws with the puzzles in this game generally. They're enjoyable for what they are, but cheapened a little by the knowledge that they could be easily bypassed with some persistence. Maybe the game would have benefited from a larger focus on just one or two of its ideas, but at least there's some nice variety, and in true Myst fashion you're left to discover the ins and outs of these things yourself, just by exploring and interacting with the environment. The moment when the barrier around Hunrath breaks is a particularly masterful example of that. After initially being drawn by the eye-catching visual design of the alien landscape, only to be repelled by the barrier, the player might wonder if they'll ever get to leave the dome. When the force field is destroyed, a massive visual effect brings their attention back to it, naturally luring them to try again. After all that build-up, walking through only to be teleported somewhere else subverts expectations while introducing a new mechanic. All of this happens without any hints or prompts and without ever removing control from the player. It's a simple but perfect moment of game design. It's those times when Cyan Worlds tries to concede to more modern design trends that they feel most out of their element. CW, whose initials I refuse to believe are a coincidence, plays the crucial role of laying out an objective so that your time spent wandering around Hunrath fiddling with convoluted mechanisms doesn't feel completely random and pointless. If that was his only function, his presence in the game would be a net positive, but he also serves another purpose. Over the years, it's become common practice for games to ensure that players have an easy way to pick up where they left off in case they've forgotten what they were supposed to be doing. It might be an info screen, a map marker, or in this case, an NPC. You can go back to CW for advice whenever you want, but the problem is, while he ostensibly wants to help the player, in actuality he's vague and unhelpful to the bitter end. He's more like the human equivalent of a bookmark than an actual character. This shows a lack of consideration for the player's mindset and ends up coming across very contrived. As a player, I don't want an NPC to spoil the puzzles for me, but as a person trapped on an alien planet, I just want to figure out what's happening as soon as possible. It would be completely reasonable to tell this guy you're not lifting a finger until you have a proper conversation, which, of course, you can't actually do. Now, don't misunderstand me, I'm not looking for dialogue options or anything. That would be antithetical to the Myst philosophy. It's just jarring that there's no justification for how these interactions play out. Cirrus and Akinar in Myst are a perfect comparison. Your time with them is just as one-sided as with CW, but the fact that they're trapped in damaged books explains it away. Maybe we're supposed to believe that CW's communicator only goes one way, but that's not really enough justification considering he's just on the opposite side of some glass. Speaking of which, casting Robin Miller as an actor is a massive throwback to the Myst series, which no doubt some people will appreciate, but the live-action tick box is already covered by the holograms, which do this job better. Not only do they actually enhance the isolated atmosphere, but the visual effects just about manage to make them blend in well with the rest of the environment. Without that distortion, CW ends up looking like what he actually is, a glorified cardboard cutout. Appropriate material for a bookmark. All in all, CW is by far the most immersion-breaking part of the game. With some tweaks, these problems could have been avoided, but the silver lining here is that you're not forced to interact with him if you don't want to. If the story had endeared me to his character, these problems could be forgiven more easily, but there's barely even a story in the first place, so expecting character development seems like a tall ask. Don't mistake that for a complaint. As Myst 5 will show, it's better for these games to have too little story than too much. The more cutscenes and dialogue there is, the more you risk shattering that carefully crafted atmosphere of, I want to use the phrase alien isolation, but that's the name of another game, so taking the first available alternatives from a thesaurus, we're going to go with exotic confinement instead. That atmosphere seems to have been a higher priority than the story, which makes sense because it echoes Myst and Riven, but it does contribute to the ending just sort of fizzling out. The game can be completed somewhat non-linearly, so the exact sequence of events can vary from player to player, but the order each sphere is unlocked is fixed, with the Mofang sphere always coming last. Considering that the purple landscape of Soria is the game's earliest and biggest tease, it's a minor slap in the face that there's nothing to do once we finally get there. Then again, I'm not sure how this could have played out anyway. The whole idea was that the Mofang were belligerent to the other races, so it's not like we were ever just going to waltz onto their home turf while they were still there. I'm guessing, even if the scope of the game had been expanded, the team probably would have added new worlds to visit instead of fleshing out this one. Even if the crowdfunding had been wildly successful and the scope of the game drastically increased to include several new worlds, I still feel as though this might have been a problem anyway. While I do think Obduction could have benefited greatly from some more content, especially because of the way that content would have cross-pollinated to the other spheres, enriching the whole game, the problem is more about setting up player expectations correctly. When you're blindsided by the ending, it always feels like it comes too soon. It's better when you give people a little bit more than they expected. As for the ending itself, there's two to choose from, but few clues to follow to get the good one, maybe because they didn't want to spoil exactly what the good ending entails. The argument is whether you should go with the course of nature or not. A nice idea in theory, but in practice nature can be pretty brutal. Just ask all those creatures whose horns slowly grew back into their own eye sockets. My point is, rather than being based on any empirical evidence, like the ending to Myst, making your decision in Obduction is a matter of agreeing with one character's gut feeling over another. Capping off the story with one final puzzle that decides the outcome is a great idea. It's just a shame that the right and wrong answer can't be derived logically like most other things in the game. At least, apart from some wobbly acting, the good ending sequence itself feels like a worthwhile closer. The motivation of the trees is revealed and the idea seems like an original one, or at least a beautiful one. Much like the game itself, it's something that'll stick in my memory, even if it feels a little underdeveloped. Obduction isn't quite the instant classic that Myst and Riven were. There's a sting of missed potential that just won't go away. I can't shake the feeling that a bit more content and some additional refinement could have brought it on par or even beyond Cyan's best works. It's easy to pine for what could have been, but even so, this isn't a game that disappointed me. If anything, it was a pretty pleasant surprise. The exotic landscapes and confined atmosphere of Obduction show that Cyan Worlds still largely understands what people loved about their previous games, and that they know how to replicate it. That's more than can be said for a lot of beloved things which have been dragged kicking and screaming back from the grave. It may not quite eclipse the best of the Myst series, but there's still enough overlap to make it worthwhile.